Good afternoon. Welcome to the weekly livestock market update. I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Megan Grebner. With us is University of Missouri Scott Brown. Good afternoon, Scott.
Good afternoon, Megan.
All right, we're going to talk a lot about, it's been a pretty big week for reports, and we'll get into those. We'll talk about some of the big news as it relates to trade in China. But to get things started, let's recap what happened on the markets as it appears to be another not so great week for cattle and hogs.
Yeah, not so great in terms of current prices on those commodities. If we start on the cattle side of the equation, we'll talk about cash live cattle that were down nearly $1 this week. Feeder cattle markets actually started down a little bit this week, but we're going to call them $2 to $4 higher as they gained some strength during the week. On the futures side of the equation, the June live cattle futures contract closed down a quarter, while the August feeder cattle contract was down $2.75 on the week. Choice box beef price was really virtually unchanged this week. We saw weakness in ribs and loins, offsetting the strength that really was in the round and brisket components this week. So mixed bag in terms of those components. On the hog side of the equation, cash barrel and gilt prices were down 75 cents this week, while that June lean hog futures contract was down hard this week, down about $6. That pork cutout value was also down $2 this week. We had weakness across the board in all those cuts, with the exception of hams up slightly this week.
When we take a look at that, how much is what's going on with the market relating to what we're seeing in that whole relation of supply and demand, specifically, I think, on the hog side of things?
Yeah. So I certainly think when you see futures markets that have been coming back towards cash, it gives you some indication that so we had that pent up demand, I think, expected in China, and I think this has been a week where markets have said, well, maybe we're not going to get as much trade with China, even despite what was an announcement of some trade occurring this week. So to me, supply and demand still matter here, and big supplies of pork and additional supplies of beef as well, for that matter, I think continue to be the short-term downer in what otherwise might be a more positive market situation.
All right, let's get into that whole amount of supply and take a look at cold storage report first. How did things shape up for the month of April?
Yeah, so I think we got a cold storage report that was reasonably favorable in terms of stocks of especially beef and pork. Beef stocks down 5% at the end of April relative to the previous month. That was certainly down less than some were expecting in terms of pre-report numbers. Pork was up 2% on the month, but that was 2% below where it was a year ago at this time. So by and large, I go, those red meat markets, especially given the increases that we've seen in pork and beef supplies, look pretty good. Now, on the chicken side, we got a little more negative news, with chicken up 3% relative to a year ago. I think that's somewhat of a negative sign when you look at where chicken prices may be going here, as those stocks blossom back again.
Also out this week, Scott, livestock slaughter. Let's take those numbers into consideration as well, and as we get ready to talk about continue to have the conversation about our supply and demand situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so I start by reminding us that in April of 2019, we did have one more weekday than we had in April of 18. So that all else equal is going to give us a little more supplies than otherwise would have been the case. But April 2019 beef production, 6.8% above April of a year ago, while pork production 5.9% above April of this year relative to 2018. Now, when we look at that on a year-to-date basis, that puts beef production up 1.1% and pork production up 3.6%. So we got lots of supplies of beef and pork coming to the marketplace. If we take the beef side for a minute, if you remember, we started the year below year-ago levels. That had a lot to do with weights that were below year-ago levels. We're now finding ourselves back in a situation where cattle weights are exactly where we were a year ago at this time. So we aren't getting that break in terms of overall beef supplies. And so I expect we're going to continue to see some growth in beef supplies. And, you look at hog slaughter data up 2.4% year to date. It just reminds me that we've got more hogs coming to the market, and those are going to continue to be here for much of 2019. I guess if I look for some good news, beef cow slaughter up 3.4% year to date suggests to me that that beef cow herd's not doing a whole lot in terms of at least growing as we think about where we've been these first 4 months.
We know we need demand to increase. How much are we focusing on that split between both domestic and global demand for U.S. beef and pork products as we see the amount of our supply continue to increase?
Yeah, well, I think we focus on both of them. And for me, I look at the domestic side for a minute and I go, we sure need this economy to continue to grow as we go through 2019. One can probably find some more signs of potential weakness in that domestic economy. I hope that's not the case because we're going to need as much domestic demand strength as we can. And of course, what could really help us out at the end of the day is what we do in terms of supplies that leave the U.S. border. And we'll have to just wait and see how some of these trade effects ultimately work out at the end of the day. But we need strength on both sides for what's now several years running of increases in beef and pork supplies.
Scott, let's also talk a little cattle on feed. Let's start first with that placements number for April.
Yeah, so if you look at the placements number for April, it came in at 108.7, and you may go, oh, a lot of cattle placed in April. And I just remind us that April of a year ago, we were very light in terms of placements in April. So in fact, when you look at that 108.7, that was nearly outside the low end of the range of the pre-report estimates. The low end came in at 108.6. So although a big number, I think that's actually a positive for markets that we got today.
What else did we need to look at, or what else do we need to look at when it comes to that cattle on feed report and those numbers?
So I think equally important. So on feed as of May 1st came in at 102.2. So also at the low end of that pre-report estimate, the low end was at 102.1. So by and large, I guess, we get a little bit of help that the numbers on the cattle side are a little more tighter than we would have expected going into that report. So maybe we get a little bit of break on the supply side, but I still think we're going to talk about beef supplies at the end of the day that are, 1 to 1.5% higher than where we were a year ago.
Are we still looking at how how it played out over the winter into the spring has impacted what's going on with our cattle numbers?
Absolutely. So we got a lot of things going on there to talk about. Number one, that weather certainly was what created lower weights, I believe, when we saw that at the early part of the year. But we've had a really interesting spring in many parts of the country. It remains extremely wet across much of what you see in the Midwest. I think most folks feel like maybe there's a good possibility for a lot of hay supply growth given how wet it's been. However, any hay that's been tried to be put up at this point in the southern part of the U.S. has probably not been put up without getting rained on at least once. And so I think it's been a slow process. And in some parts of the country, it remains cold, wet and cold. So we needed some warm weather to make that grass grow a little bit better. And we're certainly seeing tough pasture conditions with just how wet it's been.
Do we also worry about the nutritional aspect of that hay that's been, I look at Missouri, that's been hit repeatedly with wet weather. My folks, my dad, I don't even want to talk about what's going on in central Illinois right now. It's awful in a lot of places. So do we worry about quality, and what does that do for quality of our beef in the long run?
Yeah, so I think we have a lot of cows that are probably in some of the worst shape they've been in for a while. We had a situation where folks were feeding the last hay they had, which of course was the worst hay that they had nutritionally for sure. And so we have a lot of cows from a condition standpoint that are probably at the low end of what they normally are like. You don't recover from that, overnight. So you've got to get that nutrition back up, build that body condition score in those cows. We may see that affecting calf crop as we look at numbers 6 to 9 months down the road as we kind of recount here 2019, just given how tough it's been out there in cow-calf country.
All right, as we wrap things up this week, Scott, I'm going to call this section Trade Aid in China and kind of lump it all in together. When we talked last week, The first signs that we could be closer to a deal on USMCA had surfaced. And I'll be honest, I've been on vacation this week, so I haven't seen a lot of what's been going on. As we take a look at that, how does that impact what's going on the pork side of things, specifically as that deal progresses?
Yeah, so I think we're getting some positive news here, so we may be a little ways from a new USMCA agreement to be in place, but the fact that we've seen us roll back steel and aluminum tariffs, and now Mexico rolling back the tariff on U.S. pork, I say maybe there's a possibility for some pretty good growth or strength in ham prices as we go forward, as those tariffs go away, and that's an important ham market for us. So, but from an overall perspective, getting rid of tariffs, I think, will be a benefit. I think we'll quickly turn our attention to whether we get a USMCA agreement all the way to the finish line or not. But getting rid of tariffs might be the most important thing to get us jump started in terms of growth of pork exports headed to Mexico.
And while there's been positive news on the USMCA side of things, it seems like the China talks are continuing to fizzle. How do we take that all into account as well?
Yeah, well, I think, again, here we'll talk about it from a pork side of the equation. It probably doesn't help us when we continue to talk about tariffs on U.S. pork products headed to China. However, ASF may continue to overshadow some of those effects. We still may be up substantially in terms of trade with China on U.S. pork at the end of the day, and we did get an announcement this week of another fairly large shipment going. But those tariffs need to going away would certainly even increase that demand more for U.S. pork going forward. And so we'll have to wait and see whether we can get that Chinese agreement back on track. But this week certainly looks like one where we're a lot further away from an agreement than we've been for a while.
And I think the other thing we can talk about this week is the aid side of things. That was announced yesterday or on Thursday. Talk to me a little bit about the implication that has overall for the ag industry, but then also as it trickles down into the livestock sector.
Yeah, so $16 billion, I believe, is what the administration's announced this week in terms of additional trade aid package. $14.5 billion or so, I believe, is headed in terms of direct payments. A little different mechanism appears to be unfolding in terms of how producers are going to get those. So instead of being focused on corn and soybeans, they're going to look at county level production, and you're going to get a single payment based on what your county looked like last year and then what you've planted this year. I think those dollars are helpful in otherwise what's been a very tough economy for many parts of agriculture today. I guess from a livestock perspective, what happens out of this package in terms of additional export assistance, if you will, how do we develop some new export markets? I always say those dollars are helpful in the long term of growing maybe some new markets that otherwise we would not be in. And as well as what are some of the domestic programs that might receive livestock products to distribute to perhaps the low income, for example. I think all those things, when you talk about growth in meat supplies, could be helpful in an otherwise pretty full pipeline these days.
I have one other question when it comes back to China. We've talked a little bit about potentially China just not turning back to pork. Does that present opportunities for other proteins? I think not necessarily about U.S. poultry, but China's poultry sector as well, if they can't get African swine fever under control?
Yeah, so the longer we go, I think the more likely it is we see a longer term switch in the commodity mix that goes on in China. And that's probably certainly a shift away from pork to an extent and towards, I think chicken's number 2 in that switch, but maybe even a little bit of beef as well. I do think that gives these other commodities an opportunity to get in the mix, if you will. And that could be positive for chicken and beef markets longer term globally, as you see the Chinese make that switch. I will continue to say, I think the one thing we want to keep our eye on is I expect overall meat consumption in China is going to be much lower than it's been for a while. So although we talk about replacing that lost pork production, it'll never be pound for pound. And we'll probably just see less consumption at higher prices occurring in China, at least for this year.
Scott, I think that'll do it for us this week as we look ahead to next week. A pretty light week relative to this week.
Yeah, we'll get a little domestic demand news on Friday with the Restaurant Performance Index, but otherwise, a fairly quiet week.
All right, we look forward to talking to you then. Have a great week. Enjoy your long weekend as well.
You do the same, Megan.
To have our weekly livestock market update delivered to your email box every Saturday morning, visit our website, brownfieldagnews.com. You can click subscribe. You can also submit questions and comments there as well. And for market updates twice daily, make sure to check out John Perkins' Market Minute. Have a great weekend. I'm Megan Grebner for Brownfield.